LaRose is a novel about the Native American Ojibwe culture and the contemporary American settled culture, and it's written by an author who's a descendant of both peoples. So it is the book that we chose as our Runwright Reads book club selection for March. Today I'm going to tell you what I thought about it, and if you read the book or if you maybe just read some of the synopsis online, I invite you to leave me some comments down below so we can talk about our different interactions with this novel. So, hey there BookTube, welcome back to my channel. The premise of the novel comes about when two half-sisters, Emmeline and Nola, marry two different men. Emmeline marries reformed alcoholic and drug addict Landro, the Ojibwe Indian, with whom she's had a tortured past. They've known each other since childhood, and they've shared the experimentation and teenage rebellion of their younger years, but they've now settled down into middle-aged maturity with marriage and parenthood. Nola, on the other hand, marries a white man named Peter Ravage, and they live just outside the reservation boundary with their two mixed-race children, Dusty and their older daughter named Maggie, who both inherit the conflicts of this cultural intersection. While there seems to be no love lost between the two sisters, and the fact that their different sides of the reservation boundary set their social experiences, their husbands are friends and their 5-year-old sons are playmates. One day, Landro is standing at the reservation boundary hunting for a deer when he accidentally shoots and kills the 5-year-old Dusty. And when he and his wife consult the ancestral spirits, they determine that their penance will be to give up their son in exchange for the son that was lost. So they deliver their son LaRose to their neighbors, who are still mourning, but they accept the gift. And so begins this kind of social experiment where this 5-year-old boy begins to be shuttled back and forth between these two families that are laying claim on him. So he is like the child of a broken marriage who's taken out of a home and eventually returns for weekend visitations. And that is indeed the boy LaRose's role. He's named after the healers in his mother's lineage. So his job is not just to heal those who are mourning, but to heal all the broken characters that parade through this book. Which, if the stereotypes are to be believed, all the characters, both Native American and the white missionaries alike, need healing. Now that we've mentioned broken characters, let's start with Landro, the father, who's a recovering, or is he, alcoholic and drug addict. His wife's brokenness comes from her ancestors, starting with the original LaRose, who as a child was sold into slavery by her own mother, sold to a trader who abused and eventually haunted her until she dies, a death that in turn scars and haunts her own family for generations to come. Talk about broken. Then there are Nola and Peter, the parents of the dead boy, who are dealing with their own brokenness and grief in a different way. Nola by contemplating suicide, but also immersing herself in household arts that is supposed to tie her and bond her to her family, but instead sets her apart. Then there's Peter, who loses himself in the Y2K fanaticism of the book's 1999 setting, putting himself and his family in debt to stockpile supplies in his garage. Meanwhile, in someone else's garage, his daughter is being bullied and abused, a situation that he is both unaware of and impotent to prevent, even while he's stockpiling supplies for a disaster that never happens. There are many other characters who appear and share their stories to weave together this patchwork quilt of horrors. There's the war veteran turned community priest who abandons his priestly roles to become infatuated with one of the women. There's the vagrant named Romeo, whose son seems to have been given to Landro in some earlier episode, which hints at some unspeakable horrors that might have happened outside of the scope of this book, and for which Romeo is paying penance for. Yet when Romeo speaks, he paints Landro as this villain who he's intent on bringing to justice. A good chunk of the book then is devoted to explaining Romeo and Landro's childhood experiences, as well as exploring Romeo's subsequent drug abuse and the petty crimes that he commits to sustain it. Overall, the novel sustains a lot of stereotypical ideas about Native Americans and their abuse of drugs and alcohol, and I was very interested in how the author presented this, considering that she's of Native American descent herself. The added level of complexity by interweaving their traditional beliefs with their newly adopted Catholic faith brought a realistic and believable paradox and left many unanswered questions. I admire the complication of the initial plot, but felt that there were too many distractions from side characters. Within these 372 pages, there were too many characters whose backstories apparently we needed to know intimately. From Father Travis, who goes bar hopping to meet sinners where they are, but eventually becoming a drunkard himself, to the tormentors who abuse Maggie, but eventually we have to follow them home to see how they interact with their parents, to following Romeo each time he shows up at a funeral to steal drugs from the deceased person's medicine cabinet. A lot happens in this novel. The alternating timelines and narratives creates a very interesting mosaic if you can follow it. The overarching themes discussed here are lost, and the collision between tradition and religion, or old versus new, and the strength of women to endure this cyclical loss and yet maintain their feminine allure. While the immediate loss it is described as the death of the son and brother, there's a rippling effect through the loss of the replacement child to the family where he comes from, the threat of contemplated suicide and what that would mean for the survivors, the threat of acts of vengeance and what that would mean for those who are affected. There's a comparison between the mother whose son is killed and the mother whose son is given away as a replacement. There's a comparison between the mother who sells her daughter into slavery and the father who gives up his child just because he can't afford to look after him. There's a comparison between the dead who haunts the living like ghosts, reminding them of their past sins, and the dead whose body is stolen so the family is not able to mourn the loss completely. All these situations leave broken hearts in their wake, and there's no real resolution except as the characters learn to forgive and move on. So if there's one enduring theme through this book, it is forgiveness and what that looks like. Like how the repentant husband or boyfriend buys a big bouquet of roses to win back his lady's heart after he's done her wrong. Here's your bouquet of roses. Here's your LaRose. There's an interesting quote from the author that appears in this New York Times book review that I'm going to link down below. And it says, throughout her work, Erdrich shows how her Native American characters took from the white man what could be of use, while holding on to the parts of their heritage that would enable them to survive. This intersection between traditional beliefs and contemporary religion is depicted in how Landro and his wife both consult the priests as well as smoke herbs in their backyard to get into a trance to commune with their ancestral spirits while looking for guidance on how to move forward after the death. However, we see this conflict as well in Father Travis developing a bond with the Ojibwe people that almost violates his priestly assignment. And when he prays, he's not even sure who he's praying to. So he categorizes God in his different revelations as the God of war, the God of peace, the God of recovery, and the God to whom he makes intercessions for these natives. There's another Read 'em and Weep quote in the book, and this time it comes from L. Frank Baum, who is the author of the Wizard of Oz children's book series, and he appears in this book as the author of an article which harkens back to a time when Baum himself was a newspaper editor and actually said that the genocide of the Native Americans was the only way to prevent them from taking revenge on us, meaning the white settlers, for what they did. The historical L. Frank Baum apparently was a trader who had gone to live and interact with these native peoples, and his comment apparently was made in order to shed light on some of the injustice that was done to these natives, but it also forces analysis of who these reservation boundaries are supposed to protect and what happens when these boundaries are crossed. So it makes it that much more interesting that the main event, and indeed the conflict of this book, happens when Landro is standing at the boundary and kills someone on the other side. LaRose was a very thought-provoking read. It definitely wasn't my favorite while I was immersed in the story, probably because I retched at some of the very despicable attitudes and acts that I was reading about. But talking more about its structure definitely brings greater appreciation for what the author accomplished with this story. I look forward to interacting with you in the comments down below. If you read this book for the book club, maybe you read it before, or if you're finally just hearing about this book now that you're watching this video, leave me your comments down below so we'll talk about it down there. Thanks for watching this video. Thanks for being a part of the Runwright Reads book club. Whether you've been reading the books with me or you're just here to watch the videos, I appreciate your support. I'm also going to be making a special LaRose edition of the Runwright Reads book box, where I curate the reading experience of a book that I've read and enjoyed. So go ahead and check out my Etsy link if you want to know more about my Runwright Reads book boxes. So we'll talk about this book in the comments. I look forward to some interaction with you. So we'll talk in the comments, and until next time, happy reading. Bye!